3, 2, 1. And we are live. We are live. Good evening. Greetings, Hotep. Peace and blessings, everybody. Akiyami here. It's a beautiful day. Hope you all are enjoying the weather, and it's a lovely Monday night. So definitely everybody knows how passionate I have been about consciousness and capital, of course, and, in our African-centered consciousness and continuing to understand who we are and where we come from. So today I have a wonderful, wonderful brother who I met a few weeks ago, and I see and saw that he has been doing tremendous work with ASCAC. And for those who may not know, that's the Association for the Study of Classical African Civilization. And he has actually lived in Tanzania, particularly Zanzibar, and went to school there. But I'm going to read his bio, and he has the title of a mwalimu, and that means teacher for those that don't speak Swahili. I have a little Swahili going on, but that's one of the early words that we learned in the cultural African-centered conscious community of sorts, and that's a teacher. So, and his name is Brother Tarik Richardson. He is a PhD candidate at Temple University. So he's getting some good knowledge there at Temple, and many of the great African-centered scholars definitely have come out of Temple and have done tremendous work with researching our Africans' history. And I think as Professor Carr out of Temple, I know he talks about Philadelphia, brother, but
yeah, when you look at most of these Black Studies programs, there's a good chance a lot of them are run by people from Temple. So Dr. Carr, yes. Dr. Beatty, Dr. Watkins, yes. Kamal Rashid.
Yes.
Actually, I'm not Kamal Rashid, but there's a good amount of us that come out of Temple.
Indeed, yes, sir. But let me read your bio more formally, just so everyone will know the context of this conversation. Mm-hmm. Mwalimu Tarik Richardson is currently a PhD candidate at Temple University's Department of Africology, and I'll let him explain what that actually is, and African American Studies. And Mwalimu Tarik descends from a family dedicated to the political and cultural upliftment of African people transcontinentally. His grandfather, Arzenia mm-hmm. Richardson, was an African-centered scholar activist who is accredited with organizing study groups and lecture series in the United States, as well as bringing Dr. John Henry Clark, Asa Hilliard, Dr. Runoko Rashidi, and Theophile Abenga to Costa Rica. His son, let me see something. Okay, wait a minute. His son, Mwalimu Tarik, father, Eric continued this work in a different capacity through his leadership in a local chapter of the NAACP. In 2012, after years of assisting his father with his work fighting for social justice and justice issues and the miseducation, and Mwalimu Tarik attended the University of Oregon and obtained a degree, studied with diversity excellence scholarship. He had obtained a diversity excellence scholarship. It's a little small, but along with the Pathway Oregon Award. In 2015, Mwalimu served as a director of the Black Student Union. That same year, Tarik traveled to the East Coast of Africa as a Gilman Scholar, okay, with Mwalimu Mokaya Bosea, hope I said that correctly, to study Swahili language and culture at the State University of Zanzibar. That's amazing. And Mwalimu Tarik, shoot, this thing keep up now. And Mwalimu Tarik presented his research findings to the faculty of Susa, and when returning from Africa, Mwalimu continued research and lecture on history and culture of African civilizations. The same year, he would travel to Atlanta, Georgia to present his research on African international relations during the Hellenistic occupation of the Nile Valley to the Association, ASCAC, Association for the Study of Classical African Civilizations. And Mwalimu graduated from the University of Oregon in the spring of 2016. Once in graduate school, Mwalimu has continued to conduct research on topics such as education, African identity, and African history, and has presented his findings across the country. In his first year in graduate school, Mwalimu received the Stephen Colvillan Award, has gone on to become an editor-in-chief of the Imhotep Research Journal and the Jehudi, I gotta know how to spell that one. That's not Jehudi. You gotta let me know how that's.
Jehudi.
Jehudi.
You had it right.
Yeah, that's in Africa. Well, and Chasset Newsletter. Since moving to Philadelphia, he has continued to balance his academic studies along with engagement in the community. In the past few years, he has become a potato tepper of Baba Ron. Yeah, I love Baba Ron McCoy, and he just retired from our regional ASCAC, and has assisted several ASCAC regional conferences. And Mwalimu currently works as a graduate teaching assistant at Temple, instructing new generation of students from an African-centered paradigm. Mwalimu Tarik has had the honor to study and learn at the feet of Malifia Sante, of course, Kwesi Asenso, Mokaya Boser, hope I said that wrong, Ama Mazama, Malanga Karanga, of course, Kamasi Nahusi, Hakimeta Budi, that's my man, absolutely. Nadov, and Professor Dr. Mario Beatty, and Brother Dr. Leonard Jeffrey. So I got it all out, my brother.
Yeah, I didn't realize how long it was until you started reading it.
Okay, well, that's the B-more thing. I'm a little slow on the draw, but but that's okay. We appreciate the work that you've done, as well as coming from a long legacy with your father and grandfather, truly being freedom fighters and conscious African centered scholars. That's a testament to the work of intergenerational passing of knowledge, and that's what we certainly need within our community. So it's a pleasure that you are staying connected to ASCAC, understand the role that ASCAC has played with maintaining and keeping the cultural paradigm and transmitting it to our community. Many who may not necessarily be in academia, but have similar opportunities to present scholastic knowledge and to be able to, learn from these different scholars that come together. So I just appreciate that, my brother. So you're doing some tremendous work, but so we wanted to we wanted to deal, and I discovered you when I was perhaps mentioning something. I think I was very inquisitive in terms of understanding the role. Well, both. I was attempting to find more about the migrations from East Africa to West Africa, but also having gone to Tanzania last year for the first time, and me just knowing about Julius and Nyerere, for instance, I was very interested. So just open up in terms of just wherever you want to start in terms of your foundation with how you chose East Africa. Let's just how that came about.
So how I chose East Africa, I think as an African person growing up in the Americas, we understand this concept of cultural alienation, right? And the history that we've gone through and purposely being stripped away from our culture and being torn away from a very coherent articulation of who we are as African people. That's something that we all know. And we can talk about the work in the last 100 years that has been done to try to reverse that damage, right? And to come back to consciousness. That's when we're talking about cultural location. So Karenga, one of the things that Karenga did, he was doing this work, talking about recentering ourselves. This work goes back to Carter G. Woodson in 1933 with the Miseducation. But Karenga was one of the first people to create an organization, right? I'm talking about the US organization. And in it, they said, we need to, if we're doing this cultural work, we need to be able to celebrate ourselves. And for a lot of people, they saw celebrating Christmas, they saw celebrating Hanukkah, and they saw celebrating other religious holidays outside of an African cultural paradigm as basically as a contradiction, right? They said, how can we be African people if we're celebrating non-African traditions? And so what they did, this is how they birthed the holiday of Kwanzaa, right? And so what Karenga did, he went back to African traditions all over the continent. One thing I will get into is this concept of ontological unity, meaning that wherever Black people are on the continent, in the Caribbean, in the Americas, or as we'll probably discuss later, in Asia, Black people are tied together through a common cultural paradigm. We don't all have the same culture, but all of our cultures are related to each other. They're variations of a bigger idea, right? And so Karenga, what he did, he started to look at the ethics of African cultures. He started to look at the values of different African groups, and he started to synthesize these ideas. And within it, he created, the Nguzo Saba, right? The 7 principles. And Kwanzaa, the Nguzo Saba, and the principles therein are all taken from the Swahili language, right? And he chose the Swahili language because of an understanding that the language of Swahili is the most widely spoken African language that is not directly tied to a single ethnic group, right? We can look at Yoruba. Yoruba is another massive African language with millions of speakers, but it goes back to a single ethnic group, right? We can look at other languages such as isiZulu, right? That goes back to a single ethnic group. Swahili is the only language that's an African language that has millions of speakers that you can't really say these are the people. And as my research shows, and many people who are familiar with East African history, that's not exactly true. That's the common discourse. But the group that does have could claim that they're the original speakers of Swahili aren't necessarily interested in ethnocentric politics, or really to an extent politics within the continent. But we'll get to that later, because this involves the history of enslavement and the idea of identity in East Africa. But my point of how I got involved with this is Karenga, through Kwanzaa, which really spread from his organization to the wider, from his organization to the African American community, and then to the diaspora. You have people celebrating Kwanzaa in Europe. There's a few people who celebrate it on the continent, not as much, but there are those. South America and the Caribbean, right? So it spread. It became a Pan-African holiday, and in this holiday, people are being introduced to Swahili, the Swahili language, and that's how I got introduced to the Swahili language. And to this day, the language of Kiswahili, Ki, when the Swahili language lets you know that's a language, that is the language that people have associated with Pan-Africanism, right? Or this idea of being able to talk to each other that transcends, any ethnic barriers that we have. And a lot of people, they say, like we're saying, we're trying to move away from European holidays. We're also trying to move away from European language. So, you mentioned Julius Nyerere. That was one of the things why he adopted Swahili. In Tanzania, there's over 200 ethnic groups. Each of these ethnic groups have their own language. And he said Swahili can be the language that binds us all together, right? It's a language of Pan-Africanism. And that understanding has spread. So originally Swahili was spoken on the coast, but it spread from the coast to Tanzania, Kenya, and it's penetrating all of its way all the way into places like the DRC now, the Democratic Republic of Congo. And so for that reason, I really latched onto the idea of East Africa and Swahili because of not only the politics that it represents, but also, this idea of transcending ethnic barriers and coming together of African people. But as we'll probably discuss, the Swahili language also has a very complicated history. I'm not sure if you're familiar with Kwame Appiah, but he was a critic of Swahili being used as a Pan-African language because of this. Kwame Appiah, so Kwame and then Appiah. So he was a critique. He's a critic of Afrocentricity, and he's a critic of Pan-Africanism. And but he does have, he's an African, he's a Black scholar. He does have his uses, but when it came to that field, he was very critical. And one of the reasons why he was critical of Swahili is because of the role that the Swahili language and many people on the Swahili coast had in the enslavement of other African people in Tanzania, notably in the island of Zanzibar. Zanzibar was the focal point of the Arab enslavement of African people. I don't like the terminology of the East African slave trade because East Africa wasn't enslaving people.
Right,
who was doing it? Who was doing it? Right.
Right.
It was Arabs, and then it was Islamified Africans, and then you also had Indians. You had people, Persians, and then you had other groups in East Asia. There's actually a Netflix show coming out on Yasuke, and he is the Black Samurai, right? But people don't say how did Yasuke end up in Japan, right? Why is a Black man in feudal Japan? It's because Yasuke was a victim of the East African slave trade. He was stolen from Mozambique by likely the Portuguese, sold to most likely people in India, and they sold him to the Japanese. And eventually he would find his way to become recognized as a great warrior in feudal Japan. But this history transcends so many different conversations. It influences, it has its part in so many different discussions that we should be having. So I'm glad that you asked me to come and join you for this talk. This is something that I've studied for years, and it's something that we often don't talk about enough. We like to talk about the European enslavement of African people, or also known as the Atlantic slave trade. Like I said, the Atlantic Ocean didn't enslave us; it was the Europeans, right? But we talk about what happened there, but we often don't talk about what happened on the other side. And in East Africa, the enslavement of African people started before Europeans enslaved African people, and it lasted after, and they actually enslaved more people. And I have a feeling, based on certain, evidence that the system of enslavement, the modern system of enslavement from Europeans to against African people, really started in part because of Islamic involvement in Iberia. I think I have, basically when I read through the history of the Reconquista, it's pretty clear that this institution was adopted by the Spaniards and the Portuguese as they were fighting the Moroccans and the other Arabs. But what was the last point I was going to make? But this history is not just this part of East Africa, because this goes back to wars that people in Sudan had against the Arabs back in the very early medieval period. So you can look up the kingdoms of Makura and Nubia. There's a lot of history there. And then the people, we like to talk about the Haitian Revolution. But one of the largest revolts against enslavement by African people did not happen in the Western Hemisphere. It happened in Iran, right? It was called the Zanj Rebellion. It was one of the most brutal rebellions against enslavement in the history of humanity. But ultimately, unlike Haiti, it didn't lead to the emancipation of African people. But I'm talking a lot, so I'm gonna stop here. But thank you again for letting me join in this conversation.
Yes, no, definitely appreciate that. Yeah, you hit on a few key points. So yes, I appreciate that it wasn't an East African phenomenon, and the focal point was Zanzibar. I mean, that was like a port city. I mean, that was like the kind of the outskirts, but there was actual incursions into farther into places like Bagamoyo. Was Dar es Salaam affected? Obviously, it was partially affected, but was there an economy developed because of Swahili as well? Many people say that Swahili developed because all of these people were trading on that what they call it, the Swahili coast is what another term that's being used. So if you can just speak to some of those dynamics because I read some different little, I picked up some books there, mostly from Catholic missionaries. So I have a few, different pieces that I'm currently reading to, kind of get different perspectives, and because they said that they came and they ended the slave trade in East Africa. So just add on to those things, brother, in terms of what you see.
Right. Well, I mean, there is like most lies or most statements, there are levels of truth. The British ended the trade of enslaved Africans internationally, but a lot of it didn't have to do with any morals or ethics. It was a lot of economic. They wanted to basically handicap the Middle East. So it's not that they cared about African people. They cared about economic competition, particularly against the Ottoman Empire. But no, so that's a good point that you raised about the development of the language alongside the development of this trade. And so we should be clear, Swahili is an African language. It's a Bantu language. A lot of people like to say, oh, it's an Arab language or it's a mix. It's not. It's an African language, and it has borrowed words from other languages, particularly Arabic, and then maybe some English or German words as well. Right. But it kind of, it's the same thing with what's the example I was going to give? The most important part of a language is the syntax, or I don't want to get too technical. It's the structure of the language, right? The words really aren't important. So English, for example, is a Germanic language, but we know most of the word, or many of the words we use, come from French. They come from Latin. Some of them are Arabic words. Some of them are from Indian words. They're from many different places. But it's not a Latin language because we use a lot of Latin words. It's a German language because of the structure. But this and the reason why I said this language can go back to a group of people, but they're not particularly interested in these politics, is because it has to go back to this idea of legitimacy. And a lot of these, the original group, people say is the Shirazi. The Shirazi in Zanzibar are the ones who Swahili is indigenous to them. But a lot of that, even the name Shirazi, Shiraz was an area in Persia. They're trying to claim an external origin for who they are. So I mean that's a whole nother conversation. Mm-hmm. But it started off as an African language, and later on, as they began to interact more with people, with other people, they began to adopt certain words. And it has to do with this concept called similitude, right? The word similitude is like the word similar. And it was basically a performance they had. When someone came, you want to be similar to them because it's a society based on trade. So if you came to me, I want to appear to be just like you or similar to you because you're like, oh, we're just the same. We can be friends. As if you're too different, why would you want to work with someone who's different rather than working with someone who's similar? So if you want to buy a book, I'm not going to force my word on book on you because I'm trying to make the trade. I'm going to adopt your word, right? And then because of the frequency, people are adopting more and more words. But we can get into, there's a whole conversation about which words were borrowed, particularly from Arabic, and which words are traditional African words, and why were certain words used and why were certain words not adopted. And so you had that dynamic, right? A lot of people like to overemphasize the foreign influence on the language, partly because they want access to claim that foreign identity. It's the same thing we see in Haiti or Haiti, where they want to claim being French, right? They want to say that Haitian Creole is a French language. It's an African language that uses a French lexicon, uses French words. But when you look at the structure, it's more similar in structure to African languages on the continent than it is to a French language. And if you're interested in more of this conversation, there's a lot written about these ideas within the context of Ebonics, right? One of my great mentors, Dr. Malefe Kete Asante, is actually the first person to write on this topic of Ebonics. Ebonics as an African language, and this conversation extends from what they call African American vernacular English, or what I call African American language, goes back to Jamaican language, which is Eurocentrally known as Patois. It goes back to Haitian Creole, and it also applies to Hausa and Swahili. But when we're looking, you asked about Dar es Salaam and Zanzibar. So Zanzibar, the people were enslaved on the island, but what happened was you had people penetrate into the interior, kidnap them there, and bring them to Zanzibar. And then Zanzibar, from there, that's where they were going all over the Indian Ocean. And if you go to Zanzibar, the people there have preserved the history through oral tradition, and they'll be able to tell you. You can go to the sites. If you know, I know you're going to Tanzania soon, but if you make your way to Zanzibar, go to the old Anglican church. They will show you where the British enslaved people, where the British put people in dungeons. Go to Mangapwani, right? And that's where the Arabs captured people and put them in the caves underneath the cities, unbeknownst to the villagers who lived nearby. Go to Stone Town, and the local historians will tell you the history of how the town was basically run by people who had their interests outside the continent, and they can show you the places where African people were sold and whatnot. Kind of like how we have Congo Square in the United States, and then Ghana has Elamina. But I just want to make it clear that Swahili, and I'm not completely convinced that Swahili was the language that facilitated this trade. It was more likely than not it was Arabic, and for certain traders such as Tipu Tip, who's in my opinion, he's the biggest trader in African history. He was an African person who enslaved other African people and then actually fought against the Europeans to continue the trade. But in certain instances, you did have African people and African, likely using African language engaged in the trade. But that's not the totality of the reality of Swahili. If you actually, within Swahili oral literature, there's a story of Fumo Luongo. And Fumo Luongo is a cultural hero. He's kind of like the Swahili version of John Henry, right? And he united all these different people in East Africa using their culture. He taught them a song to resist assimilation and to resist Arab imperialism. And so there's a very complicated history. And there's one more point I was trying to get to, but it's slipping my mind. So I guess I'll leave it right there for you.
No, that's really in depth, brother. Indeed. So how long were you in Zanzibar? So you were on the island of Zanzibar, right? I mean, which part of Zanzibar were you actually?
So I was in a program for a summer, so that's about 3 months, and okay. I stayed in Stone Town, and I was able to travel around the island, and I was able to talk to local historians in smaller villages, or not just in Stone Town, and I went to Dar es Salaam, and it wasn't a very meaningful trip. When I went to Dar es Salaam, I was basically just there to get more inland. Oh, that's what I was going to mention, because we're talking about the inland, what was happening inland. And you want to talk about compare it to West Africa, right? So one of the differences is, if you read Ibn Battuta, Ibn Battuta was a Muslim. He was a Muslim explorer, I'll say, during the medieval period, and he traveled around the world. But he talks about how the East Africans were, they did a better job assimilating to Arab and Islamic culture, and he celebrated that the cities of like Kilwa, for example, would do monthly or yearly jihads, and they would raid non-Islamic communities and enslave them. And so you can check that out, in Ibn Battuta's Journeys to Africa. But yeah, so if you go to certain places like Kilwa, that history is still preserved. So I mostly stayed in Stone Town, which is it's a very old city, and it's actually one of the first cities in the world to have I don't believe it's plumbing, but I think a sewer system. I think that's what it is. But it's a beautiful place, very safe. There's not a lot of crime there, and there's a lot of good conversation. People there talking about this complicated history, talking about how to build, and it's also home to a very violent Pan-African revolution. I shouldn't say Pan-African, but a revolution that did have Pan-African undertones back in the 1960s. And there's a lot of conversation that comes out of that's kind of what my research is looking at the conversation about the Zanzibar revolution. But that's not particularly important to what we're talking about. But basically, there was a lot of tension in society, in Zanzibari society, even till this day, because of the history of enslavement in East Africa.
Yes, yes, yes. No, so when you say that you stayed on the island of Zanzibar, I mean, so, and just understand I have only a cursory understanding, but there are more islands.
Oh,
that are like around, but do they just call all the islands Zanzibar Islands, or like like the Mafia and the other one Pempe, or do they just or do they call them individual names? Since you were there a little bit longer, I was.
Yes. So Zanzibar, like you said, Zanzibar is not one island. There's many islands. So the main when people say Zanzibar, because Zanzibar City is on one island, right? There's Zanzibar City. Below it is the historical town, Stone Town. That's kind of like an extension of Zanzibar City at this point. That island is known as Ungonja, right? And then north of Ungonja is the island of Pemba, which is more rural, more agricultural, and that's actually where the revolution started. And then there's smaller islands. There's like you said, there's Mafia Island, there's Prison Island.
Right.
I'm trying to think of what the others. There's I shouldn't say innumerable, but there's a great many smaller islands.
Right.
But those are the main ones. And the most populated ones is Ungonja and Pemba. Those are the main two. The other ones, might have some sites, but there aren't really notable populous centers on those other islands.
Right. That's it. Okay. All right. Yeah. So no, I appreciate the clarity even for me. So you said you were doing research in that area. I mean, was obviously talking to some of the locals, as you mentioned, but what are some of the locals? How do they feel? Like, I mean, you said that there was still a little tension, and I saw a documentary talking about how some of the locals are still economically exploited. They're still, living in poverty comparative to some of the major, or what they said is that tourism still hasn't totally benefited any of them. Can you describe some of the same people that owned everything during these times? Are they still the main power brokers?
It's a yes and no. So and this is what the revolution was about. So Zanzibar had been dominated by Arab imperialism for centuries at this point. So what happened? The Portuguese arrived. They demanded certain things from the local kings, the local rulers, and people weren't really in a position to oblige to that. But the Portuguese opened fire and invaded Zanzibar. And so the story goes that the local kings pleaded for help from the Omani Arabs. And the Omani Arabs came down and fought the Portuguese and then just never left. And so over time, Zanzibar became a very important center, not only in the enslavement, the trade in enslaved African people, but in many other trades, the ivory trade and the textile trade. The textile trade was huge, so much so that Britain and America were bending over backwards to try to get involved within this trade. It was one of the major centers within the Indian Ocean. We're talking about Arabia, Persia, and particularly India, right? All these people working together along with East Africa, right? And then you also had the Ethiopians were involved as well, and the Somalians. And so eventually the Omani moved their capital from Muscat, that's in Arabia, and they moved it to Zanzibar. And that's where the Sultan lived. And they were there for a while. Eventually, Zanzibar installed its own sultan. You know, you might have heard of like Sultan Said or Sultan Said Baragash. You know, and they were a family who were mixed between African people and Arabs. And actually, many of them would take on Ethiopian wives. And so who the major power brokers were these people, you know, mixed race people, people who had taken on Islamic faith and more Arabic identities or Persian identities, people who basically didn't identify as African. Because like in Sudan, they started to make a correlation of being African as being someone who could be enslaved, right? If we remember in Sudan, that's one of the conversations right now is the word they use for black people literally means slave, right? And so what happened, sorry, this is a long-winded history, but it's going to take us a while. But the British eventually went to war against Zanzibar and won. It was one of the fastest wars in human history. I think it only lasted 6 minutes. Right? And so they took over the island, and then fast forward to decolonization, right? The British leave. In part, they left because of the Mau Mau Revolution, right? And because of the Maji Revolution that happened before, 100 years before. And these two revolutions, as well as the Haitian Revolution, you know, 150 years before, proved that being a white supremacist did not pay, right? Because African people were going to make you pay. And so because Maji and the Mau Mau Revolution, it was not a tactical victory. It was a moral one. They said you were in the wrong. You're putting African people in concentration camps. You were killing, you know, you're discriminating against us. You're oppressing us. And you're spending so much money to do this. It's not worth it. So for the British, most of what they do is not based on morals or ethics. It's based on money. So they were like, okay, this colonization business is not worth it. Same thing with enslavement. They didn't care about African people being free. They started industrializing and putting children in factories. They said, we don't need African people to do this. So they ended enslavement, right? And they said, and we're tired of people in Jamaica trying to fight us on Christmas, right? And so they ended enslavement. They ended colonization, but they did not give power back to African people. They gave it back to the Arabs and to the people who were mixed with Arabs and to the people who said that they were Arabs and Persians, right? This is a huge problem. Zanzibar is an African place. So what happened was John Okello from Uganda, he came over, right? And he said, this is not how it's supposed to be. Zanzibar is an African country. Zanzibar needs African leadership. And he declared war on the Sultan, right? And it was a guerrilla war. And he was able to mobilize the farmers in Pemba. And they spread the revolution from Pemba to Ngonja, and they were fighting in the streets. But the war, there was so much racial tension between, and basically when I'm saying Arabs, in Zanzibar, I could be considered an Arab. It's, you know, light-skinned people versus dark-skinned people. Like I said, a lot of times they're manipulating who they are. You know, some people might be mixed or whatnot. So there was so much tension based on this history of race, of enslavement, on colonization, that it resulted in a genocide, right? Where African people were murdering non-African people. And I even saying non-African people doesn't sit well with me because many of these people were African too. And so after the war, you know, the Arabs were removed from power, right? The Sultan, the Sultan's gone, right? And then they joined into a union with Julius Nyerere and Tanganyika, and that's where you get Tanganyika, Zanzibar, Tanzania, right? And then John Okello. But so the thing about John Okello, he's not a Muslim. Zanzibar is 99% Islamic. So the local leader said, we can't have him here because he's going to keep pushing, right? And so they ended up, basically, he went on a trip. He left. I think he went to Tanzania. And then the people in Zanzibar said, you can't come back. He ends up going to Uganda. He links up with Idi Amin. In Zanzibar, he was known as the field marshal, and he said, "Oh, this is a great day. Now Uganda has two field marshals," and we didn't hear from him since. So it's more likely than not he was killed by Idi Amin. But the issue why they got rid of John Okello is because religion was not addressed. Malcolm X says, if we talk about religion, we're gonna be fine all day. Leave religion at the door. That's not what should have been done. They should have talked about religion, because the religion on the island basically allowed for the people who had this traditional power to eventually reassert themselves into the political conversation, right? And were able to wiggle their way back into positions of power. So now what you have is African people, especially people who are traditionally, practicing traditional African spiritual culture, they're still marginalized. They're still not predominant, and you have all this racial tension. People are still kind of weird about, talking about the revolution, because your neighbor, may or may not have had a family member who was murdered. The people I stayed with when I lived in Zanzibar, basically their entire family were murdered. And so it's a very hard thing to talk about. And then it's also difficult for people to talk about Pan-Africanism there, because so much of the rhetoric used by the revolutionaries was reminiscent of Africa for the Africans, right? Like that, like, oh, that sounds like Garvey, right? So then they associate Garvey maybe with what happened with the revolution. And you kind of see the same thing happen in other places like Rwanda, or in certain places in South Africa, where you see rhetoric be used, but then at the end of the day, it's they didn't politicize the rhetoric. They used it for other purposes. I guess that wasn't as long-winded as I thought it was, but that's kind of a conversation about the power dynamics. And I think you were more asking about tourism. So tourism reasserts itself because after Britain had colonized Zanzibar, it had basically handicapped Zanzibar's capacity to be a maritime power, right? And I think Britain especially focused more on industrializing and putting resources towards India and other places. So when Zanzibar got its independence, and I think part of the reason why Zanzibar joined into a union with Tanzania was so that they wouldn't be sanctioned and would be able to have an international reputation. And so when they became their own independent country, ruled by African people, they really didn't have the infrastructure or the capacity to be a major trading power anymore. And so, and Britain had basically turned them into a tourist economy at that point. They had tourism, they had fishing. You still have trade going on, but it wasn't like how it was before. And so now you have, the whole island and many of the other islands are now basically tourist destinations for British and German travelers. The same way Hawaii is for Americans and Japanese and Chinese.
Yes. Okay. Yeah. No. So this is things. Yeah. This is there anything that you think the listening audience know? I want to keep for about an hour, and now my phone is starting to act a little funny. But what would you say? So let me go back. So much of what can be described as did Islam, for instance, as a religion, was that like a catalyst to say that, was that like used to justify, to say that the darker people are to be enslaved? Or was it a combination of just economics?
It was. That's one thing I forgot to mention. Because it was during the period of enslavement and the period of colonization that this became an issue. But it is forbidden, is haram, for a Muslim person to enslave another Muslim person, right? So to be a non-Muslim person would put yourself at danger for becoming enslaved, right? And which is one of the reasons why it was the people in the interior who were being targeted, because they were still at this time practicing traditional African religion. You know, they hadn't been converted to Islam or Christianity yet. The people on the coast were the ones who had converted. And like I said before, Ibn Battuta writes about how great it is that the city of Kilwa launches yearly jihads against the people on the interior and raids them for African people. And so it did become part of this, but it wasn't. I shouldn't say it wasn't Islam was doing this. The major issue has to do with identity, right? Where people were alienating themselves from their African selves, their African culture, to gain access to these other networks, right? And then, you know, in order to access these economic circles, but we shouldn't. I don't think we should ever divorce the two, right? Because, you know, a lot of folks will say, oh, it's just about economics, just about economics, right? But if it was just about economics, you would see certain other phenomena develop, right? But when you would say, oh, it's just about race, it's just about race or whatever, it doesn't answer a few questions about why. So the two really go hand in hand. But that was the case for the period of enslavement. And then also you have people who would change their identities and have interracial relationships. You know, they would marry women outside their race to gain access to these networks and whatnot. So there's all these different factors that go into it. During the colonial period, the British continued this idea, this dichotomy between African people who identified as African and African people who were interested in alienating themselves. For example, if you were identified as an Arab or as an Asian, just a black Asian or a black Arab, you would have certain economic privileges that other African people didn't. And this is why rice became a status symbol, right? Or even the ability to cook rice, because a lot of people in East Africa, they eat what we would call in West Africa or in the diaspora fufu, right? Or it's called bugali, has a lot of different names, right? That's an African dish. Rice, and I'm not sure about other places because, you know, like the Nigerians and the people in Guyana, or not Guyana, but in Ghana, they argue about jollof rice and whatnot. But in East Africa, rice is not an indigenous dish. It had to come from somewhere else. But it became a status symbol because if you were not an African person, you would have access to get rice. And so by being able to cook rice and have these rice dishes when you invite people over, it was showing, oh, yes, I'm basically a superior person because I'm not an African, right? And if you went to someone's house and they're eating bugali, right, then people are like, oh, you must be lower in society. It basically created a racialized caste society within the island political dynamics, which kind of exists today. When you go over to people's house, they're not, or you go to a fancy restaurant, they might give you the option to eat bugali or fufu, but it's usually going to come with rice. They don't grow rice on the island. There's no rice paddies. You know, it has to be imported from somewhere else, which, and I that's why I can't speak to other places like in West Africa, because I don't know if they have rice paddies or not. But many places we have these dishes that we associate with, you know, a common people, right? Like, for example, in Jamaica or in the Caribbean, a lot of people like to eat codfish, right? Codfish is a cold water fish. You can't catch cod in the Caribbean. So, which means their national dish, their food, it has to be imported from the British. So this goes back to your question about power dynamics, right? Where the power always was coming from external, and the people on the island in the Caribbean or in Zanzibar were basically using external power to legitimize themselves, right?
Wow.
But that kind of speaks to that dynamic. But yeah, when you really look at food culture, you need to, like, where does the food come from? Why do people eat it? What ingredients are they using? And what does that say about who they are? Kind of the same way Britain, for example, their national dish is an Indian dish, right? So what does that say about British culture, right? They don't have a dish that they respect enough. They have to go steal it from somewhere else. Where did they get the wealth? They had to steal from somewhere else. Where did they get their knowledge? They had to steal it from somewhere else. But anyways, that's another conversation.
Wow. Yes. Definitely. So my final question, and of course this can go very, very far and deep and wide. Of course, long history, but there are some still indigenous tribes that are strong there. We interacted with the Shaga people, and of course, many people see and know about the Maasai people. Many still have a semblance of their indigenous culture still intact. So can you speak to some of, I know you were in Zanzibar, so did you actually see any of them during these times? Because we went to Arusha, Bagamoyo, Salaam, and Kilimanjaro, Serengeti. So we went a few places in Zanzibar, Stone Island. So we were in, we kind of hit a few different places in this time, and in June and then October. We're going to a few different, I think we're going to the Mafia Island place, but most of the time I'm going to be in Zanzibar. In Bagamoyo and Arusha. I'm sorry, I think Arusha this in June. So did any of that culture, were any of them like in the Zanzibar area or?
Yeah, so the interesting thing about traditional African culture, especially in these cosmopolitan areas, is ironically they're being preserved by tourism, right? Because what's happening is a lot of people they don't practice African traditional religions anymore. They're Christians and Muslims, but they basically put on a show, or they practice forms of traditional African religion and culture as a show for tourists, right? And as inadvertently created a culture where they preserve it. Like, for example, people don't care about masks. They don't care about these these certain symbols or icons or anything anymore. But they continue to create them because people go to Africa saying, "Where's the mask? Where are these things?" Right? So you have in Zanzibar, you do have a lot of that. You go down to Stone Town, you walk down the street, the markets, you'll see all the African, the masks, you'll see the clothes, you'll see this, but people don't have those in their houses. They have them in their stores. People wear kanzus. A kanzu is like the white robes, right? And so, but you mentioned the Maasai. The Maasai have a place of veneration in Zanzibar culture, or in Zanzibar society, and in East African society. And part this is like more of like a cultural myth. I don't know how true it is, but there's stories that the Maasai people waged war against the Arabs and protected other African ethnic groups against enslavement. The story goes that the Arabs would go in, enslave people, they would train them out, go back to the coast, and the Maasai would ambush them, right? And because of that, people have gained a great respect for Maasai warriors. And so if you go to Zanzibar, you'll see, instead of security guards, you'll see people in Maasai warriors in front of banks, in front of businesses, in front of homes. right? So you'll see that, and that's kind of why. And like I said, it's not really, it doesn't necessarily have anything to do with actual history, because it's like may or may not have happened, but it's the way that people have understood who these people are and their role in African society. And then, but then I shouldn't make it sound like just because the island is 99% Muslim, that African spirituality or African traditions don't exist. There's 2 points I want to close with. So one is the people who are reporting and doing their research and talking about African spirituality, they don't respect African traditions as religions, right? So when we're looking around doing our research, you're not going to find them talking about African religion. You're going to have to look for them talking about cults or secret societies or all these coded words, right? But when you look at what's going on, what they're talking about is it's basically it's very similar to what's happening in places like Yoruba land, right? With Yoruba religion. And so if you go to Zanzibar, there's this tradition, it's called pepo, right? Pepo means to sway, you're swaying. And the word comes pepo because you're being mounted, you're being possessed by an ancestral spirit or a deity. And so when people saw them, they're like, oh, they're swaying. But when you start looking at this tradition of pepo, which they call a cult, you're like, oh, this is the same as a comb, or this is the same as Yoruba religion. This is Lukumi, this is Santeria, this is Condomble, right? It's the same, it's this different variation of African religion. The other point is, even within Islam, in Africa, is, with different variations or levels of, intensity, African religion was able to survive within it. So one thing that's important to look at is, how do people understand God, right? What is their cosmogony? And so they adopted so many different aspects and so many, the book of the Quran, the Holy Quran, right? You would think that they would also, and we talk about all these words they adopt. So you would think that they would adopt the word of God from the Arabs, right? You adopt someone's religion, you adopt their God, right? But they don't call God commonly Allah or Yahweh. They call him Mungu, right? Mungu is an African word for God. You go to Rwanda, they will call him Mungulu, right? You go to other places, he's Mungu, right? You go to Mozambique. So Mungu is a Bantu word for God. So it makes you wonder, why would they adopt this religion? All these other words, you want to talk about all the words that you want to adopt from the Arabs. Why wouldn't they adopt a word from God, right? It's because there's still that little bit of culture that it's in the back of, it permeates throughout everything in Zanzibar and African society. But the issue is that people don't want to talk about it because they want to highlight these foreign influences in this foreign culture. And that has to do with the idea of religious and cultural centricity, right? You look at Islam, for example, the holy language. When you read the Quran, the most holy language that you can read it in is Arabic, right? All the holy sites are in Arabia, right? Mecca and Medina, right? They say all people are equal, but that's not true, because the Sunni and the Shia are fighting over who's the most holy, and they both agree it goes back to Muhammad, like who's the closest to Muhammad, who's an Arab from the Quraysh tribe, right? So they're saying, is it another Quraysh, or is it someone who's directly related to him? So all of this goes back, and you look at this, how does this relate to African people who are, the only people who actually are even within this story are the Ethiopians, who were Christian at the time, right? So you have people who are basically trying to find a way to insert themselves into this history, into this cultural phenomena, to gain legitimacy. And that's an issue that, it's not just a Zanzibar issue, but you'll see this issue, you'll bet in a lot of different ways in many different aspects of American society. You'll see it in Creole societies in the Caribbean, and you will see it, really, you see it in basically every place that has been subjugated to colonization and acculturation.
Wow. All right. Yes, sir. Well, Definitely, you laid out much of the key, insightful, in-depth understanding of the whole Tanzania and Zanzibar, and that issue. So you hit it from many different angles, brother. So I'm very appreciative and grateful, and thank your Baba for being present with you. Hope he is very proud, as many of us Africans certainly are proud of you and your work as you continue to expand and matriculate and complete that dissertation, right? Where you at in that process? You there just about, right?
Yeah, I'm working on it.
Yeah, yes, sir. Yes, sir. That's a beautiful thing. So if anybody wanted to reach you or see some of your other works, and I know you've written some journals in a few places. So if anybody wanted to see anything that you think or support your work in whatever direction you're going, and continue to work with ASCAC, I must say, shout out to many of my ASCAC scholars, and definitely, I'd like to applaud them for keeping you in the fold with them as well. So you can, put out whatever closing information that you may have, brother.
Yeah, if you want to follow my work, I'm pretty active on academia.edu.
Okay.
I have a few things that are up there right now, but as I continue to work and publish more things, you can see what I'm working on.
Right.
And then they also have a feature that you can write to me, or you can engage in my work and stuff. So I'm active there, academia.edu, or I believe it's academia.edu. It's either academia.edu or academia.com.
Okay.
And the last closing statement is, this history. When we talk about it, there's a lot of difficult and complicated issues that arise. But if we're genuinely interested in Pan-Africanism and coming together as African people, we need to talk about this history. We need to talk about the implications, and we need to figure out how to move forward. And so, first and foremost, I'm a Pan-Africanist. Well, actually, first and foremost, I'm an Afrocentrist. I study, I think, and I talk about Africa from an African-centered point of view, right? They're the center of my analysis. And if we are to be Pan-Africanists, those two things need to be on the same page. You can't see my hand, but they need to be on the same page, right? The second point is, if we, and this is, I guess, a little bit more controversial, but if we are to be serious Pan-Africanists, we need to have a serious conversation about African religion, or religion in Africa, right? I think for far too long, even within Pan-African discourse, have African religion and African spiritual thought been marginalized. And I'm not just talking about, people saying, oh, I believe in spirits. We have our own traditions. We have our own systems. We need to talk about them, and we should start thinking about how we can politicize around them.
Wow. Yes, sir. Indeed. And Malifia Sante lays out. He's said that on more than a few occasions, I must say. So, so I know you're right there with him, and you're synergizing your own interpretation of your experiences there. So I'm grateful, and thank you, my brother, and we appreciate you. And so you enjoy the rest of the evening, and we shall speak soon, and you keep up the re-Africanization, nation building, and family development, and till we free. Peace.
All right, peace. Shimhotep.
Shimhotep. Peace. And then